everybody, and I've just, my phone's just started ringing. That's perfect timing. Maybe we'll just edit that out a second. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tough Topics in LD. We are joined, as always, by Sean Williams. And today we have a special guest with us. It's Neil Crowther. Neil, feel free to say hello and give us a little bit more background about yourself.
Hi, my name's Neil Crowther. I'm, what am I? I'm an independent consultant professionally, but also activist. I'm a co-convener of the Social Care Future movement, which has a vision for the future of social care, which puts the emphasis on people living their best lives as a result of well-designed and organised support. My background's in disability rights. I worked at the Disability Rights Commission and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, work in the UK and across Europe and internationally on independent living in particular is my kind of core area of interest.
So Sean's more qualified, sorry, Neil's more qualified than we are. So just for reference for everybody.
Sean's not qualified at all.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, you're just the freeloading student, aren't you? That's it. So what sort of, the reason we've got Neil here today is there was obviously, to give a bit of context for those of you who don't know when you're watching this week, people with learning disabilities have been given priority access to the COVID-19 vaccine, which is something that a lot of people have been calling for a long time. It came about, coincidentally or not, as a result of Jo Wiley and her sister Fran, who was ill, quite severely ill with COVID, and Jo used her platform to try and spread the message and try and advocate for her sister and people with learning disabilities at large. That sparked some interesting discussion from people, and one of the people that put something I thought was really interesting and worth picking apart and not picking apart, sorry, that's not critique, airing a little bit more was Neil's blog post. Neil, you give us a bit more context on that, if that's okay, please.
Yeah, so it's absolutely clear that Jo Wiley played a decisive role in causing a government U-turn, and that really is the power of celebrity and a voice and let's face it, authenticity. I mean, she clearly got across her love and concern for her sister and created a profile that others had struggled to. I mean, it wasn't the case that Jo Wiley was running this campaign on her own any more than it was the case that Marcus Rashford has been running a campaign against child poverty on his own. Lots and lots of other people was involved, but I think her involvement has been the turning point. And I think it's crucial to say clearly what has mattered more than anything is that prioritisation of people with learning disabilities who now, as a result, will be vaccinated. So that's the most fundamental thing. But what interested me in this was the way the case was being made, which I don't necessarily, some have really kind of launched at Jo Wiley and been very critical of her personally. I don't think that's fair or reasonable. But there was an interview that she gave on the MAR programme on BBC One on Sunday morning. And Amar explored more than just her experience with her sister. He was asking her to explain more generally why people with learning disabilities were more likely to get COVID or to die earlier and so on. And what I found problematic was that her response was to really locate it within her sister's experience, to then give the viewers the impression that actually the main reason people might die earlier is because they're hard to treat in hospital. Because I think she talked about security having to be, I mean, her sister was obviously very, very distressed and confused and bewildered to be there. Security had been called. But the impression given was that was what would happen. And then she went on when asked to say what her message was, to effectively say all people with learning disabilities are helpless, are unable to help themselves. The only way forward is for us all to kind of stand there. Talks about people being precious but vulnerable and so on. And again, I think, she was very much talking from her own personal experience, but the programme didn't give a platform or a voice to anyone else to talk more widely about what these issues are. And of course, the reality is we already know, as with other groups that have been seriously affected by COVID, what lies behind that were existing inequalities which expose people to greater risk. So we already know that people with learning disabilities die on average 20 years earlier than the population at large. We know that the Office of National Statistics just a week earlier had published facts that said the single biggest predictor of people dying earlier from COVID with a learning disability was living in a congregate care facility. And all this was just missed. So my concern isn't necessarily, clearly Jo Wiley's intervention has led to a really powerful and important outcome for lots and lots of people, and lots of people will rightly celebrate that. But at the same time, it's left an impression in the public mind that the reason people die of COVID is because they're hard to treat and because they are intrinsically vulnerable, not because of all the social and economic factors that prevail on people's lives and actually put them in the firing line, not just of COVID-19, but of health inequalities generally. So that was the argument I was making. But there was another bit to it as well, which maybe we'll come on to, which I think speaks to a kind of a wider tension that's been there for some time between sometimes the expectations of some families, some parents about how their adult children will be supported, and the objectives of advocates for disability rights and for independent living. And I think that played out in this context as well, where, you know, some parents or families have wanted a sort of protective shield put around their children. Some advocates have actually talked about rights as though it's about leaving the family, moving away from the family. And so what I was talking about in the blog is perhaps they need to reconcile that we need to kind of change the way we think about people's interaction with their families, rather than make the idea of rights being leaving the family and completely moving that to one side. Because if we carry on in that way, it'll just remain a contest between these two ideas, and we needed to think about that too. I'll say more about that as we go on, if that's helpful.
No, really useful, and thank you for expanding on that. Just for a bit of context, we did reach out to anybody that was available and willing to come on, and Neil's the other one who's got any time kicking his heels, obviously. Apparently, no, we have had some thoughts and interactions with some self-advocates as well, and Jenny Carter has shared her thoughts with us as well, which we'll get onto later on as a self-advocate. Right. And Jenny is a fantastic self-advocate who has done work for years around this. Yeah. One of the questions,
part of our social care future movement as well. Jenny is, yeah,
fantastic. One of the questions I wanted to just mention, you mentioned about the public were left with a message of people with learning disabilities being vulnerable and unable to care for themselves. Do you think that people were left with that message, or you think that message was there all along and this somehow reinforced it? You know, was it necessarily damaging in of how it was presented, or was it more reinforcing narratives that we think already existed?
I think it reinforced where people's existing understanding probably was. And we know that I've been leading a piece of work with Social Care Future, which is looking at how we change how people think and feel about social care, which inevitably means exploring how people think and feel about those who draw on social care. Mm-hmm. And people's default thinking is that social care exists to look after vulnerable people who can't look after themselves, mm-hmm. which is what we're trying to change. So yeah, I expect what Jo said reinforced what many people already thought and how they kind of felt and imagined. So
I do apologise. You just go back into this. I don't know if you remember your train of thought now, but I've just
I think sorry. Yeah, I think what was said didn't necessarily introduce new themes to people. It probably reinforced what people imagined to be the case. Apart from perhaps the sort of section about the reason people are likely to die earlier is because they're harder to treat. I'm not sure people consciously thought that before, but certainly the themes around vulnerability and people needing to be looked after, I think, are very prevalent. So no, I don't think she introduced something new. I think my argument in the blog was, when you have an issue enjoying this level of profile, which it rarely does, this is the moment and the opportunity to introduce those kind of new ways of thinking, to point to the causes and make sure that they're clearly understood, because you're not going to get chances like this again. So that was really what I was saying.
No, yeah, and it's not necessarily so. I was being slightly quite careful with the question in there, in terms of, it was sort of a belief of mine that I share very similar thoughts with you. So.
Yeah, well, I think I was saying as well. So with Social Care Future, one of our kind of the key hurdles that we've identified is the public narrative and public understanding, and so we have set about doing a piece of work to try and shift that, to understand where thinking currently is and how we could actually take people on a journey to think differently about it. We're about to publish that, so we've finished that work. And what that has confirmed really is that most people's default thinking about social care is guided by their thinking about who they imagine uses social care. And so, you know, in sum, the narrative that's out there now is that social care is about looking after vulnerable people who can't look after themselves. And so I think you heard that narrative play out in what was said. And so, you know, what we're actually trying to do is work out, you know, if we want to put forward an idea of social care that's much more about empowering people to live the lives that they choose to lead in the community, how do we tell that story in a way that actually is persuasive to the public and the public come along with it? And we've got the evidence, we know how to do it now. Excellent. We've got to do it, but we've done the research to kind of get there. So that was very much on my mind as well in writing that blog about narrative and impact and attitude.
Just to pick up on a point you made there, Neil, when you talked about getting the message across and getting that counter narrative, and the people, you know, themselves giving that counter narrative, doesn't that highlight some of the tension you mentioned earlier about between sort of families and parents and also self advocates? Would you agree that it sort of highlights that central issue which you mentioned earlier as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's really hard, isn't it? Because there's absolutely no doubt, you know, Jo Wiley was in this. She originally brought this to public domain because she'd been invited to her vaccine before her sister, and it was the iniquity in that. And then, of course, her sister became very ill, so she was being interviewed while her sister was in a hospital. Now, you know, I know my dad died last September. He'd had dementia. He spent 10 days in hospital. The idea I could have given a coherent interview in that kind of context, I just couldn't. You know, I'd been too emotional, and you know, so I think it's unfair to kind of talk about Jo in that way. But I think the editors of the MAR program and their ability to actually paint and try and pull together a kind of more rounded picture is what I'd be critical of. And you know, I think actually a number of other BBC outlets and other outlets have, and I think it's been really positive, given platforms to self-advocates throughout this period. And I think we actually heard the authentic voice of people and their own experience a number of times. So that's great. That's something to celebrate and something to build on. I think the point I was trying to make in the blog, just to explore that a bit more, was making, and it might sound an odd analogy, but you know, something we've seen a major shift on around the world is attitudes to LGBT people. And in particular, one of the key changes has been a shift towards equal marriage and equal marriage campaigns, which have both ridden off that change in attitudes, but have helped drive a change in attitudes as well. And what perhaps people aren't aware of is how conscious a shift in messaging there was that lay behind that. So for a long time, gay rights activists have been arguing for same-sex partnerships as a civil rights issue. The whole language of that was very othering, because nobody talks about getting married to, well, very few people would talk about getting married to secure their civil rights or talk in that way. People get married because they love one another, and it's about making a commitment and all those sorts of things. And one of the other problems with the way that message landed was that prejudicial attitudes were unable to imagine that gay people would get married to form a family or to be part of the family. And so that shift towards equal marriage as the language of the aspiration was deliberate. And the messaging then was all about love and commitment and togetherness. But one of the absolutely key things, if you look, for example, at the campaign in Ireland, was to situate all that within the frame of the family. So the spokespeople are mums and dads and grandparents, and it's all about this kind of journey together. And the reason I raise that is because I think perhaps sometimes when we've put forward the idea of people with learning disabilities having equal rights, we've done it as though they're journeying away from their families into some kind of form of isolated independence, when actually what rights would mean in practice would be people as full members of their families and their communities, fully included. And that framing of people leaving their family, going away from them, I think it creates a needless kind of fear. Whereas if we were able to kind of reframe how that relationship with family should work, that people have a kind of adult role in there, you know, we certainly don't want to reinforce the kind of more paternalistic custodian idea of care that's been there, but people as being part of their families and communities within a web of relationships and support, then that would be fine. So that was what I don't know if that makes sense, but that was kind of what I was trying to say in the piece, really.
Oh, thank you, Neil. No, and it's really interesting actually to think about. You know, we did an episode that was looking at, it was about burning bridges, who holds the matches, where we're joined by Helen Hassel, a mother of a young man who had complex disabilities. And it was interesting to reflect on some of your points about that, sort of taken away from the primary vaccination thing, but about people continuing on through their lives as part of the family rather than somehow being lost. And I think, you know, for a lot of parents as they go through transitions, that, you know, that there is that element of losing, and potentially we as professionals can reinforce that, you know, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And maybe, you know, it's be interesting to see how we progress and the things that we can reflect on and learn from this. Just to touch, sorry, is there anything from that, Neil?
No, I think that's right. I think I was reflecting on this the last couple of days because there's a report that came out from the think tank Demos about the future of social care, which has caused huge controversy. And it's by a Conservative MP and very much puts the family at the centre, but it's a rather conservative idea of family and where family sits. But I think it's dangerous to kind of just seed that idea to Conservatives, you know, because the family is really important to all of us. And to sort of put ourselves outside of it, I think there's a chance to kind of reclaim that and redefine it and reframe it, because whether it's our relationship with our own parents once we're adults, or whether it's our ability to start our own families, it's absolutely crucial to many of us. So I think it's a really important debate to have. And actually, one of the things that often public services do, and certainly social care is guilty of, is not strengthening those family relationships and ties, not making them work well, but actually subverting them. So, you know, again, I think about my mum and dad's relationship as my dad's dementia developed, and the sort of presumption that my mum, who was in her, you know, mid to late 70s, was just able to provide this endless amount of care and support to him as he needed more and more support. But the tensions that grew up between them as a result of that were really destructive. You know, it was love that caused her to kind of do it. But let's imagine, for example, if we thought of something like social care as actually supporting really strong, authentic family relationships, not creating dependencies that people resent, creating really strong relationships. And I don't think we do. So I think that's, again, part of this and something we could explore a bit more.
Certainly. Just we touched obviously on self-advocates, and we were trying to, unfortunately, I'm a bit of a pain in the bum today in terms of scheduling, and we wanted to try and get some sort of recording out so that this is relevant and timely. But Jenny Carter has shared some thoughts. She really wanted to try and be on, but unfortunately couldn't make it. But she shared some thoughts, which she's happy for me to share on here. And she says that I think that there are some of the comments from Jo Wiley weren't helpful. They missed the point that there are people with learning disabilities and or autism who fight for others with the same disabilities. They're self-advocates, and these people can help others to speak up via the advocacy groups, which over the last 10 years have really suffered because of cutbacks and lack of understanding by some people of that they are really needed. We're only vulnerable because society and professionals in the system, what they can do, and they do get in the way. She said that can't National Men Cap, instead of coming up with things that are sometimes unhelpful, work with self-advocacy groups to change the narrative that people are valuable? If that changes, hopefully that will mean everybody is treated better. And I think there's some great points in there. I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on those.
Well, I would agree with that. I think that, you know, that for me, that was the big problem really for what was said. It was this sort of portrayal of people as inherently never able to be the heroes in their own story, always kind of really to be kind of rescued or their situation resolved by others. You know, I have no problem with a call for solidarity and allyship and the idea of people working alongside people, and that's fine. But to this kind of old charity kind of model idea of people just being hopeless. I think the fact there's this tendency on either side to homogenize a group as though they're all of a similar situation. You know, I think about, again, you know, personal experience, think about people with dementia. There are really great new groups of people living with dementia, self-advocates, forming now, and I love seeing that. I love seeing this kind of move where people who have kind of hitherto just been objectified develop this voice and this power. Nevertheless, there will clearly be people whose condition has progressed to a stage where their ability to take part in that kind of self-advocacy will diminish, and where other people may have a kind of more prominent role, their family members, their partners and so on, in advocating for them. Obviously, the test is the degree to which that advocacy is for people's genuine will and preferences, or whether people are simply substituting their own views and decisions, and that's a whole kind of complex kind of terrain. Really, what I'm saying is, I think, it may be the case, I have absolutely no idea, that, with Jo Wiley's sister, I don't know anything about Fran or Fran's ability to be a self-advocate. I don't know, and I just wouldn't want to kind of presume. Whereas I clearly know Jenny is a very, very able self-advocate, as is many of her kind of colleagues, to actually stand up for their own rights, and to form allyships with non-disabled people and others who stand behind them and beside them.
Certainly, and I think Sean, you mentioned that you'd heard. I think it was Scott who was on the radio recently.
Yes, I think he's been on 5 Live and Radio 4 as well. So they have been platforming people who were self-advocates, just not necessarily on the Andrew Marr show, where most a sizable portion of the nation is watching, is a captive audience on a Sunday morning.
It's interesting and actually I do take heart from this, Neil, in listening to what you and Jenny and you guys have been doing, because one of the questions I like to come back to, and always like to come back to, I have a big notion that I think that learning disabilities as a sector group, whatever you want to term it as, has a PR problem in terms of how we frame things and how we frame messages. And it's really interesting to hear that you think that this new piece of work that you guys are going to be bringing out, I think sort of turns the tide on that, or we sort of crack the narrative of the messaging. And I think with public messaging, particularly you mentioned about LGBTQ plus, and the consciousness and thought processes and research that goes into actually changing those narratives and structures, rather than it just being an ad hoc, one person's amazing tweet changed the world sort of situation, which I think we'd probably all like to believe happens, but doesn't exist. So it's pleasing personally, as a sibling of somebody who had learning disabilities, to hear that we think we can finally have something that's going to have teeth. And that's not to diminish any of the work that's gone in the past. I think it has just really struggled for elbow room in what is an ever crowded rights-based society.
Yeah, I mean, what we've got at the minute is the research that shows us that we could do something. It doesn't mean there's a lot of work to actually do it. And as you say, you're kind of competing in an information society for space to do something creative and engaging. And some things do just catch fire, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement or whatever else it might be. And it's also not just about messaging. I mean, the other thing that we mentioned, Scott Watkins, Scott's part of an inquiry that we've helped set up, which again is designed to send a very strong signal, because this inquiry into the future of social care is led entirely by people whose experience comes from drawing directly on it. Because time and time again, we see conferences organised and events talking about the future, and there's nobody on the platform, nobody involved that actually uses care or draws on care to live their lives. So in a way, we want to change that. Yeah, I guess our interest is ultimately that our feeling is power should be in the power to the people, really. Power should be in the hands of people to lead the lives that they have cause to want to live. And that transition is economic, it's political, it's social. You have to operate at a number of levels. Having a narrative that shifts that, creates that mindset is one part. Things like the inquiry, things like Scott being on the radio talking about people with learning disabilities are all critical factors in that. And I think there are lots, as I said, lots of good examples of the media making that shift. Yeah. The BBC News and 6 and 10 o'clock news has been doing it quite a while. Nikki Fox has been really going out of the way to make sure that we're hearing from disabled people directly. Jay McCubbin on BBC Breakfast, I think, has done some amazing work to sort of bring the whole issue of people with learning disabilities living in being confined to ATUs into the public mind. So I think there are some really good allies within the media that are helping to shift this as well, and all of it's important, as is what you're doing here.
Yeah, well, I think we're probably just a bit of drop in the ocean, but I think what we said to you before, really, on Neil, and our whole sort of reason for existing within this Tough Topics and LD entity is that we wanted to try and lend a voice that Sean and I felt was missing from allyship of people with learning disabilities, and that was the voice of the professional, or the practitioner is probably a better word. People whose job it is, for want of a better phrase, that makes it sound like we don't necessarily care and we're not here for the right reasons, but I certainly assure you we are. And it's our role to not just, I'm a physiotherapist, so my job is to rehab and support people to be physically capable to engage with their livelihoods, but that doesn't mean that I can't play a role in supporting people with advocacy. And I think my personal message to advocates is, I'm following you on social medias, I'm engaged with the work that you're doing, I am learning from you guys every single day. So please keep doing what you're doing. And as much as this little show is a small thing that, Sean and I have cobbled together on a high-tech Zoom meeting with, high quality kit, we just wanted to try and create a voice from the professionals that are saying we recognize as well, and everything isn't rosy, and we want to support people. It's not to replace the voice, it's to support and add volume to the voice and the movement.
I think that's really crucial. I mean, it's like everything. If you sort of, I'm an undisabled person in this space. I don't see my role as kind of defining opinion or what people should think. I see it as being in service to those kind of goals and the aspirations that people want, and bringing what expertise I have to that. That's where my role begins and ends. And then I think. But I think it is really, really crucial to have voices from the inside, voices of practitioners who again are kind of committing themselves to kind of trying to realise that vision. So we've set forward this vision for the future of social care, but it's only going to be achieved if people who have technical know-how and professional expertise or whatever commit to it and try and bring that change about. And of course, social care future movement isn't just of people who draw on social care and support. It's open to anyone who commits to that vision. So we have within it directors of adult social care, providers, professionals, academics, anybody that kind of shares that. The idea is to kind of co-create that future, and not just to campaign for somebody else to do it, but to be it, to actually begin making the change ourselves. It's interesting. I remember, I think I wrote a blog about this at the time, but a few years ago, my dad had ended up in hospital. Interestingly, because we thought he had a hernia, and at some point in those few days, he had a minor stroke, and he ended up being in hospital for a ridiculously long time. And it was right over the Easter holidays. And this idea of a 7-day NHS is a bit of a fantasy, because it was like a ghost town during that Easter weekend. So there were none of you people weren't there. Physios and people like that weren't around. But anyway, so he was stuck on this stroke ward. It was grim. I don't think he got particularly high class kind of care. It was fortunate that we could be with him the whole time. But it was just really desperate, and we were really worried about him, and it just felt like he was just being kept alive. That was it. There was nothing more kind of going on. And then I remember the day after the Easter break, suddenly the hospital came to life, and the thing that changed was the physios came in and the occupational therapists, and this gear shift was remarkable, because suddenly this was about somebody's life and somebody getting back on their feet and somebody being who they were, and it was all about his interest and what motivated him. And everything changed. And so for me, that was almost reframing an action, through the actions of people, and the insight and what these professionals obviously saw as their role, which, at the end of the day was to get him out of that hospital bed, but it was equally about getting him back on his feet, understanding what he was about, what made him tick. The questions were different. It was like, what matters to you, not what's the matter with you. It was fascinating. Sorry, I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think, for me, this idea of reframing runs deeper than language. It is about actions and behaviours, and how people foresee their roles and their relationships to people is all part of it.
Yeah, completely. And I think as much as, we started off talking about the COVID and Jo Wiley and Frances, it's sort of, I think hopefully people can see that, it is part of a wider challenge that we face as people who support people within this area. And work with people in this area. And I think, as Jenny mentioned earlier on, people have been working for decades on changing these narratives, and actually she picks apart the fact that that work has gone unnoticed, and actually, it felt like the more of the platform was the thing that affected that change, and therefore, that highlights the need for us to adapt in our approach and not continue on thinking that everything's rosy. Yeah. And I think Einstein says that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So things have to change. We have to be part of that change. We have to work with self-advocates and people with learning disabilities and other disabilities to make that change happen and support them to be the rock stars, or at the center of it. Lead singers, that's probably a better analogy.
Absolutely, I think that's key, and not alone. I said that, allyship, solidarity's great. I think that's all really, really good. I think the other thing I'll just say though that's helpful is that the research we've done around how to talk about social care differently shows not only can we lead people to understand it in a different way and support a different model, which is much more about people living the lives they wish to choose, but as a result, they actually then show more support for investment and reform and give social care a higher priority. And the reason that's important is that actually it shows that we don't have to keep saying social care is for vulnerable people and it's all broken and in crisis. We can actually put forward something better, and it moves people along, which has been, I think, and that's we 25 years into promises to kind of reform funding, and nothing's happened. And yet the sector is often still hammering this same message time and time again, and it's just not moving us along. So that was why we wanted to do it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Sean, have you got anything to add, or are we happy to wrap up there?
No, I think that's a natural conclusion, but you're saying it's a complex issue, and it's about getting that narrative, even if it is or the counter narrative, incremental. It's about moving people alongside with us and together.
Yeah. Certainly. Neil, thank you ever so much for your time and thoughts, and a thank you again for Jenny as well, for her time and her contributions over social media. She did really want to be here with us, and I apologise that my diary has been relatively inflexible today to support that. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, Neil, where can they find you?
Twitter. Spend far too much time there. So it's Neil M. Crowther on Twitter, probably the best way.
And thank you very much, Neil. And Sean and I will put our information in the credits as well. So once again, thank you very much, Neil. Thank you as ever, Sean, and we'll see you all again next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.